Okay, so we'll start with the next section of Genesis. And this is immediately after Cain and Abel. And there's a short story to begin with, just a fragment. I called it Giants of the Earth. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, so this is after Cain and Abel, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days will be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now there's been all sorts of attempts to interpret those few rather jumbled lines, but I see it as a reflection of a classic development of hero mythology, which is, and this is sort of nostalgia for the past. One of the things Mircea Eliade pointed out was that what happens to human memory in pre-literate cultures, because nothing is written down, is that what needs to be preserved gets amalgamated. And so imagine that you have a culture that's based on fishing, we'll say. So you have to be a good fisherman, you know, and human beings who use simple tools to fish are unbelievably good fishermen. They know every bloody thing you can possibly imagine about fish, because otherwise they die. So it's really important that they learn everything about fish. And maybe they've been fishing for like 13,000 years or something like that. So there's a lot of accumulated knowledge. And so then the question is, well, who taught mankind how to fish? And the answer is fragments of individuals across history. But that's, you know, you're not going to remember the damn fragments. You put them all together into the amalgam of the heroic fisherman, you know, the guy who established the pattern for proper fishing, whatever that pattern happens to be. One of the patterns might be, don't take all the damn fish because there won't be any for the next year, or something like that. But all those fragments of discovery get amalgamated into heroes of the past. And then what you do if you're a fisherman is you act out the heroic fisherman of the past. And so the idea that there were men of renown or heroes in the past is just a fragmentary, what would you call? It's just a fragment of that sequence of ideas. That back in the past there were mighty human beings who established the proper patterns of being. And they were the sons of God who took the daughters of men to wife. Now, and it's interesting too, because we do know that the more competent men are disproportionately likely to leave offspring. So it's a perfectly reasonable way of formulating the circumstance. On to the flood. This is from Mircea Eliade, who wrote a book called A History of Religious Ideas, which I would strongly recommend. It's a 3-volume set. It's quite readable, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I really like it. And this is what Mircea Eliade had to say about flood myths. As has been well known since the compilations made by R. Andre, H. Usner, and J.G. Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, the deluge myth, the flood myth, is almost universally disseminated. It is documented on all the continents, although very rarely in Africa, particularly in the desert, unsurprisingly. And on various cultural levels. A certain number of variants seem to be the result of dissemination rather than spontaneous regeneration, let's say, first from Mesopotamia and then from India. It is equally possible that one or several diluvial catastrophes gave rise to fabulous narratives, but it would be risky to explain so widespread a myth by phenomena of which no geological traces has been found. Well, Eliade wrote this quite a while ago. I think he wrote that book perhaps in the 80s, maybe in the 70s. But since then, there actually has been quite a bit of evidence advanced in various circles for the existence of catastrophic floods that occurred within the relative human civilization memory, let's say. So the West Coast Indians, for example, I suppose that's the wrong word. The West Coast, I don't know what to say either. I know Kwakwaka'wakw Carver, who told me a flood story, and they have a story that's almost identical to the story of Noah, except, of course, it involves giant canoes, but it's the same story. They release, if I remember correctly, a raven, but Noah releases a raven first and then a dove once the flood comes to an end. And it has a Tower of Babel issue to the same story. So the canoes are all put together. It's not one giant canoe, it's a bunch of canoes all together. They ride out the flood. And then the canoes separate and go all over the world, and that's why there are people all over the world. So anyways, the story is very widely disseminated. But, you know, there were floods in North America not that long ago. So there were floods, you can look up the Missoula floods, 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. And the Kwakwaka'wakw people have probably been on the West Coast for something like 13 to 14,000 years. So, and, you know, you can maintain an oral tradition for a very, very long time. You think, no, but traditional societies don't change. That's why they're traditional. And so they have the same stories over generations. They remember the same stories. So when the Missoula floods, which were a consequence of melting glacial ice, discharged up to, they figure there were 55 of them between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, discharged volumes up to 15 times the volume of the Amazon River. So these are major league floods. And then Sears et al. Published a paper in 2008 called Climate Change and Post-Glacial Human Dispersals in Southeast Asia, claiming that there were multiple floods, particularly affecting Southeast Asia between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. So there Iliad might be a bit wrong about the notion that there were no geological traces of such catastrophic flooding. But anyways, it doesn't matter because we're still looking at this from a psychological perspective, and that's fine. The majority of the flood myths seem in some sense to form part of the cosmic rhythm. The old world, peopled by a fallen humanity, is submerged under the waters. And sometime later, a new world emerges from the aquatic chaos. In large number of variants, the flood is the result of the sins or ritual faults of human beings. Sometimes it results simply from the wish of a divine being to put an end to mankind. The chief causes lie at once in the sins of men and the decrepitude of the world. It's a brilliant analysis, partly because it draws this lovely parallel between, which I mentioned a bit earlier, between the fact that things go wrong all by themselves, but that you can speed that along by not paying any attention, you know. So if you're in a relationship, you know, a relationship takes an awful lot of maintenance. And you know when it needs to be maintained because you start developing some distance from the person that you have the relationship with, and then that starts to become tinged with a little bit of dislike, and hopefully not contempt, but a little bit of dislike, and maybe some emotional distance. And you feel that, and you think, well, it's hard to tell what you think, but you feel that anyways. You know that that's emerged. And so then you have a chance at that point to repair whatever's gone wrong. And that would require some retooling on both of your parts, maybe one person more than the other, but whatever. It would require a serious discussion like, look, I've noticed that this has been happening, and maybe it's you and maybe it's me, and we should probably figure it out, because if it was you, that'd be convenient and everything, but if it was me, then I'd like to fix it, because then it would be fixed. And so that's why you listen to your partner, because they might tell you that there's something stupid about you that you don't know, and then if you could fix that, then you wouldn't have to be stupid in that way anymore. And it's actually one of the it's one of the genuinely useful features of having a partner, because do you really want to be stupid and then continue to repeat your mistakes ad nauseum for the rest of your life? I know it's more convenient to do that than to have a, knock down, drag them out argument about just exactly why you're stupid and how you could fix it. But still, it's better to have the argument. So the chief causes lie at once in the sins of men and the decrepitude of the world. And the sins there are generally either acts of commission, where people do things that they know to be wrong, or they fail to do things that they know would be right. Doesn't really matter. Sins of commission are usually judged more harshly, say within the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I think there might be a bit of an error in that, because sins of omission can be a real catastrophe. And so here's a flood idea. You tell me what you think about this. So, so there's this idea that a judgmental being will flood you out if you continue on your wayward ways. And that seems like a little bit of, it's one of the examples of Jehovah being a little on the harsh side in the Old Testament, not something that modern people really approve of so much, because we like our gods sort of domesticated, let's put it that way. And unfortunately, that isn't how it tends to work. But I've often thought about the reaction in North America to the hurricane in New Orleans. Because there's two ways of reading that, right? One is Mother Nature. has a little fit and sends a hurricane into New Orleans and wipes everyone out. And isn't that a catastrophe? And isn't that an example of our fragility in the face of natural power? But there's another way of reading it. Maybe this is unfair, but it'll do for the purpose of illustration. It's like, you know, the Dutch build dikes, right, to keep the ocean back. And they're actually pretty effective at that because their country is mostly underwater. And it turns out that if you go to Holland, it's actually not underwater. And so their dikes are working. And so the Dutch, who are very organized people, and they better be because their country is supposed to be underwater, right? So you better be organized if your country is supposed to be underwater. And so they are very organized, and they have a rule for their dikes, which is they try to estimate the worst possible oceanic storm that will come in 10,000 years and make sure that the dikes will withstand that. Well, from my reading, the Army Corps of Engineers in New Orleans built the dikes for a storm every 100 years. And that's not so good because we live about 80 years, let's say, so that means the probability that one of those storms is going to come whipping by in a lifespan is pretty damn high. And then, so that perhaps wasn't the wisest of planning, especially because some of New Orleans is actually supposed to be underwater. And then worse, you know, Mississippi is a state that's quite well known for its corruption. And so you might also say that a tremendous amount of the money and time and resources that could have and should have and was planned to go towards fixing the problem didn't. And so the hurricane came along and, oh my God, wasn't it a natural disaster? And the question is, what bloody well makes you so sure that it was a natural disaster, right? Because if the infrastructure would have been maintained and built to the specifications that were certainly technically possible and would have actually been less expensive in the long run to build, and everyone knew it, and the hurricane came along and wiped out the city, why do you think that's a natural disaster? To me, that's a natural example, if you think about it from a metaphorical perspective, of a judgmental God deciding to use a flood to teach a moral lesson. And you might say, well, that's pretty harsh. What about all those flood survivors? It's like, yeah, well, the whole flood thing was kind of harsh. And so pointing out that there were steps that could have been taken and also that I doubt in the aftermath have been taken, even though everyone knows now exactly what had happened, is you might consider it a diagnosis, but it's irrelevant because what I'm really trying to tell you is how the mythological stories would line up on this, because you can tell a story about Mother Nature manifesting her catastrophe and potential for tragedy, or you could tell another story of an absolute failure of the human social structure and the human individual level because of the corruption to address a problem that everyone knew was there. And so that's a good example of how the flood comes when you're not behaving properly. You know, and one of the things that's quite interesting about the Old Testament and the people who wrote it is that they always assumed that if the flood comes, that meant you weren't prepared. That's the rule, right? It's like the a priori axiom. They think, you got flooded out? Hey, you weren't prepared enough. Well, how can you tell? Well, you got flooded out, right? That's the evidence. And you might say, well, that's not very fair. It's like, fair isn't the point. The point is, do you want to get flooded out again or not? Because fair would be, well, you better figure out why you got flooded out and fix it so it doesn't happen again. And that's the moral thing to do when you're thinking about morality as walking the path that's most appropriate to get to the destination that you think would be the best possible destination.